Eldon Halil's fingers danced over the control panel as the research shuttle trembled violently, alarms blaring in his ears. Through the front window, he caught glimpses of swirling purple clouds and the sharp emerald glow of the planet's bioluminescent surface below. "System override! Come on, work with me!" he muttered through gritted teeth. The onboard AI's monotone response made him wince. "Warning, critical engine failure. Impact imminent." Eldon cursed under his breath. He wasn't a pilot. He was a scientist. He'd joined this mission to collect data on alien flora, not to reenact a crash scene from an action holovid. The shuttle's controls resisted every desperate attempt to stabilize, and as the planet's atmosphere grew thicker, the shuttle's descent became a freefall. The jungle canopy loomed closer, a seemingly endless mass of glowing green and purple. Eldon braced himself as the ship clipped the tops of massive trees. A grinding screech filled the cabin as branches scraped against the hull, and then, impact. When Eldon came to, the world around him was eerily silent. The acrid smell of burning metal and the tang of ozone filled his nose. He groaned, pushing himself upright. His ribs ached, and a gash above his eyebrow trickled blood, but he was alive. "Computer, report!" he rasped. Silence. The crash had fried the system. Stumbling out of the shuttle, Eldon was greeted by a humid wall of air that smelled of earth and strange alien flora. The jungle was alive with faint bioluminescence, its towering trees connected by glowing vines. In the distance, strange bird-like calls echoed, and enormous insects buzzed past. "All right, Step 1, Eldon muttered to himself. "Figure out how not to die." He grabbed his emergency pack and a handheld scanner, quickly cataloging his surroundings. His initial awe at the jungle's beauty faded as he noticed movement in the underbrush. He froze, clutching the scanner like a weapon, though it wouldn't do much good if whatever was out there decided to attack. "Hello?" he called out. "I'm just a scientist, not a threat." The response was swift and terrifying. A spear hurtled past his head, embedding itself in the remains of the shuttle's hull. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing. They were women, their skin shades of deep twilight blue, their movements fluid and predatory. Each carried weapons that gleamed menacingly in the faint light. Eldon swallowed hard. "Okay, not the warmest welcome, but I can work with this." One of the women, clearly their leader, stepped forward. Her armor, crafted from what appeared to be animal scales and woven vines, reflected her commanding presence. Her piercing gaze locked onto Eldon, and she raised her spear. "Kneel," she commanded, her voice steady and cold. Eldon hesitated, glancing at his bruised knees. "I'd love to comply, but my legs aren't exactly in top shape right now." His attempt at humor fell flat. With a sharp nod, the leader gestured, and two warriors grabbed Eldon by the arms. Their strength surprised him as they forced him to his knees. "I mean no harm," Eldon protested. "My ship crashed, and I'm just trying to survive." The leader tilted her head, scrutinizing him. "You trespass on sacred land. You will answer for this." "Great," Eldon muttered under his breath. "First alien contact, and I'm already on trial." The leader signaled for her warriors to move. Eldon was dragged through the jungle, his attempts to resist futile. As they ascended into the heart of the jungle city, Eldon's scientific mind couldn't help but marvel at his surroundings. The city was an intricate network of platforms and walkways built into the massive trees. Everything seemed to grow organically, yet there was an underlying precision to its design. Warriors moved with purpose, and glowing fungal lanterns illuminated the pathways. As they approached the largest platform, Eldon caught sight of a throne carved directly into the trunk of an ancient tree. Seated upon it was a figure who radiated authority, the woman who had captured him. "Let me guess," Eldon said, his voice tinged with nervous sarcasm. "You're the queen?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "I am Altria, ruler of this tribe. You will explain yourself, outsider, or face judgment." "Well, Queen Altria," Eldon began, "I'd love to explain, but I'm not sure how to summarize unintentional crash landing on alien sacred territory in a way that doesn't sound, bad. His attempt at levity was met with stony silence. Altria's gaze was like ice, and her warriors seemed eager for her signal to strike him down. "Enough," Altria said sharply. "You will be held until we decide your fate." Eldon was shoved into a cage suspended high above the village. As the warriors walked away, he leaned against the bars and sighed. "Not exactly how I imagined first contact," he muttered. That night, as the jungle hummed with life, Eldon couldn't help but reflect on his situation. He was alone, surrounded by hostile aliens, and utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. Yet, a part of him couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. Whatever happened next, it was bound to be interesting. The next morning, Eldon awoke to the sound of voices outside his cage. He opened his eyes to find Altria and several warriors standing below, their expressions unreadable. Altria gestured sharply, and the cage began to lower, its vines creaking under the weight. "So, what's today's plan? Breakfast in bed? A trial by combat? Maybe both?" Eldon quipped, masking his unease. "You speak too much," Altria said, her voice clipped. "Your words are a shield for your weakness." "Words are a weapon if used correctly," Eldon countered, earning a few curious glances from the warriors. Altria ignored him, motioning for two warriors to pull him from the cage. As they marched him through the village, Eldon noticed the wary yet intrigued stares of the tribe. Despite his precarious situation, he couldn't help but analyze everything: the architecture, the tools, the subtle hierarchy among the warriors. They stopped in the center of the village, where a ring of warriors had gathered. Altria stood at the edge of the circle, her spear gleaming in the sunlight. "You claim to have value, outsider," Altria said, her voice carrying authority. "Show it. Prove you are more than a weak, unarmed interloper." Eldon looked around, panic bubbling under his calm facade. "Prove it how? A math test? I'm great with equations." A warrior stepped into the circle, armed with a staff that glimmered faintly with embedded crystals. She was tall, fierce, and clearly experienced. Eldon swallowed hard. "Ah, combat trial, of course," he muttered, "because violence is the universal language." The warriors laughed at his comment, but Altria silenced them with a glare. "Begin." The warrior charged, her movements precise and deliberate. Eldon dodged clumsily, nearly tripping over his own feet. He wasn't a fighter, but he was a fast thinker. He noticed the warrior's weapon hummed faintly with each strike, suggesting it emitted a small sonic wave on impact. Using his scanner, Eldon quickly analyzed the staff's properties while dodging her attacks. "Interesting design," he said, sidestepping another swing. "The resonance in the crystals enhances kinetic energy. Clever." Eldon spotted a nearby vine hanging low and ducked under it, luring the warrior forward. At the last moment, he yanked the vine, tangling her weapon and forcing her to stumble. Taking advantage of her momentary distraction, Eldon grabbed a handful of loose dirt and threw it toward her face. She reeled back, disoriented, and the crowd gasped. Eldon held up his hands in mock surrender. "I concede. Let's call it a draw before I accidentally hurt myself." Altria stepped into the circle, her expression cold. "You fight like a coward." "I fight to survive," Eldon replied, meeting her gaze. "And survival is something I'm very good at." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she turned to her warriors. "Take him back to the cage. He lives, for now." Back in his cage, Eldon began piecing together everything he'd learned about the tribe. He sketched diagrams on his tablet, making notes about their weapons, their city's structure, and the surrounding ecosystem. That evening, Altria visited him again, her expression as unreadable as ever. She stood just beyond the cage bars, watching him work. "You don't seem like a warrior," she said finally. "I'm not," Eldon replied without looking up. "I'm a scientist. My weapon is knowledge." "Knowledge does not protect you from predators," Altria said. "It can," Eldon said, glancing up at her. "If you understand the predators well enough." Altria tilted her head slightly, intrigued despite herself. And do you think you understand us? I'm working on it, Eldon said with a small smile. But you're a tough puzzle to solve. Her lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. You speak in riddles, Earthman. I think you like that, Eldon said, leaning back against the bars. For a moment, Altria seemed to consider his words. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned and walked away, leaving Eldon to wonder if he'd made progress, or dug himself deeper into trouble. Over the next few days, Eldon was allowed limited freedom under heavy guard. Altria claimed she wanted to see if his knowledge had any practical use, but Eldon suspected she was testing him. He studied the jungle's ecosystem, cataloging its flora and fauna. One afternoon, he pointed out a cluster of plants with glowing red leaves to Altria and her warriors. These plants release a gas that attracts predators, Eldon explained. If you harvest them carefully, you could use the gas as a deterrent for hunting parties. Altria raised an eyebrow. You assume we need your advice to survive. No, Eldon said. I assume you're smart enough to use every tool available, including me. His response earned a faint smirk from one of the warriors, but Altria remained stoic. We'll see if your knowledge is worth anything, she said curtly. That evening, Eldon overheard a conversation between Altria and one of her advisors, Naira. He's dangerous, Naira said. Not because of his strength, but because of his ideas. He's planting seeds of doubt. He is planting nothing, Altria replied, though her tone lacked conviction. He is an outsider, nothing more. And yet you let him walk among us, Naira pressed. The tribe is watching, my queen. Altria said nothing, but Eldon could see the tension in her posture. She was torn between protecting her people and exploring the possibilities his presence offered. The next day, Eldon was brought to a council meeting. The tribe's leaders debated whether to execute him or allow him to prove his worth further. You've seen his tricks, Naira said. They mean nothing against true strength. Strength isn't just about muscle, Eldon interjected. It's about adaptability, innovation. If you don't evolve, you stagnate. His words caused a stir, but Altria's sharp voice silenced the room. Enough. She turned to Eldon, her expression unreadable. You have one chance to prove yourself. Fail, and your life is forfeit. Eldon nodded, his heart pounding. I won't let you down. As the warriors escorted him out, Altria's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Something had shifted between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fine line they were walking. The conflict between tradition and innovation, strength and intellect, had only just begun. Eldon stood in the village square, a small crowd of warriors and elders watching him warily. His scanner projected a hologram of the jungle, showing how water sources were drying up and predators were migrating closer to the tribe's territory. He had spent days gathering data, and now his findings were impossible to ignore. The jungle is speaking, Eldon said, his voice steady. These patterns aren't random. Something is disrupting the balance, and if we don't act, your tribe will face more than just predators. The crowd murmured, their skepticism palpable. One elder, a gray-haired woman named Ciala, spoke up. You claim to know our jungle better than we do, outsider? No, Eldon replied, meeting her gaze. I'm just pointing out what the jungle is showing us. You've lived here for generations. I'm asking you to look at the signs. Altria watched silently from her elevated platform, her expression unreadable. Naira, her closest advisor, stood beside her, arms crossed. Your Majesty, Naira said quietly, this is a waste of time. He speaks like a storyteller, not a warrior. Altria didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on Eldon as he explained his plan to redirect water to a drying spring, using a combination of natural barriers and the tribe's ingenuity. His confidence was unnerving, even to her. Let him finish, Altria said at last. Over the next few days, Altria reluctantly assigned a small team of warriors to assist Eldon. Among them was Kira, a sharp-eyed warrior with a knack for observation. Kira was skeptical of Eldon, but curious about his methods. You think you can fix the jungle with your machines? She asked, as they worked to build a makeshift dam. No, Eldon said, wiping sweat from his brow. But I can help it heal itself. The jungle has its own balance. We just need to give it a push in the right direction. Kira frowned, but didn't argue. By the end of the day, they had successfully diverted water back to the spring. Eldon's plan worked, and the tribe gained a crucial resource. When they returned to the village, the sight of the flowing spring caused a ripple of astonishment among the warriors. Even Ciala nodded in approval. Not bad for an Earthman, Kira admitted grudgingly. The success brought Eldon a small measure of respect, but it also fueled division within the tribe. Some warriors began to see him as an asset, while others, like Nera, viewed him as a threat to their traditions. One evening, as Eldon reviewed his notes in the dim light of his quarters, Altria entered without warning. Her presence filled the room, and Eldon looked up, startled. "Your work has stirred the tribe," Altria said, her tone neutral. "Good or bad?" Eldon asked cautiously. "Both," she admitted, stepping closer. "Some believe your ideas could strengthen us. Others think you will weaken our resolve." Eldon set his notes aside. "And what do you think?" Altria hesitated, a rare crack in her composure. "I think you are different from what I expected." He smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "Do not," she replied sharply, though her tone lacked its usual edge. "This is not admiration, Earthman. It is curiosity." "Well, curiosity's a good start," Eldon said. The next day, Eldon accompanied Altria and her warriors on a hunt. It was meant to observe predator behavior, but it quickly turned into a life-threatening ordeal. As they moved through the dense jungle, a low growl echoed from the shadows. A massive predator, its sleek body a mix of jaguar and reptile features, emerged, blocking their path. "Stay back!" Altria ordered, her spear at the ready. Eldon's instincts told him to flee, but his scientist's mind took over. He noticed the predator's ears twitching, reacting to subtle vibrations in the ground. "It's hunting by sound," Eldon whispered urgently. "We need to distract it, loudly." Before Altria could respond, Eldon grabbed a nearby hollow vine and blew into it, creating a sharp, piercing sound. The predator flinched, its focus broken long enough for the warriors to strike. Altria's spear found its mark, and the creature fell. "That was reckless," Altria snapped as they regrouped. "It worked, didn't it?" Eldon shot back. Altria didn't reply, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, reluctant respect. As the days passed, Eldon and Altria's interactions grew more layered. Their arguments became less combative and more like debates, each challenging the other's perspective. One night, as they stood on a high platform overlooking the glowing jungle, Altria spoke quietly. "You frustrate me, Earthman." "Good," Eldon replied, leaning against the railing. "It means I'm making an impression." "You are persistent," she said, almost to herself, "and resourceful, but your ways are not ours." "They don't have to be," Eldon said, "but maybe they can help." Altria glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps." The turning point came when a group of scouts returned with alarming news. A rival tribe known as the Skyriders was preparing to invade. They were a formidable force, known for their aerial predators and ruthless tactics. Altria called an emergency council meeting. The tribe's leaders debated strategies, but none seemed sufficient to counter the Skyriders' air superiority. "We must fight with honor," Naira argued. "Face them in the open." "That's exactly what they want," Eldon interjected. Naira glared at him. "This is not your fight, outsider." "It is if it means keeping the people who have kept me alive from being slaughtered," Eldon retorted. Altria's sharp voice cut through the tension. "Enough." She turned to Eldon. "What would you suggest?" Eldon hesitated, aware of the weight of her question. "We can't outmuscle them," he said finally, "but we can outthink them. Use the jungle to our advantage." The room fell silent as Altria considered his words. Then she nodded, her decision made. Prepare yourselves, she said, her voice resolute. We fight in 3 days. The Sky Riders arrived at dawn, their approach announced by the low rumble of massive wings slicing through the air. Altria stood at the center of the village, her warriors assembled around her. She exuded calm authority, though her clenched fists betrayed the tension beneath her composed exterior. Eldon stood nearby, hastily explaining the final details of his plan. Reflective panels made from hardened tree resin had been strategically placed around the village to disorient the Sky Riders' aerial predators. Sonic disruptors, hastily crafted from the hollow vines Eldon had studied, were hidden among the trees, ready to be activated to create bursts of sound that would interfere with the creature's echolocation. It's risky, Eldon admitted, his voice low so only Altria could hear. But it's the best shot we have. Altria studied him, her piercing eyes searching his face. If this fails, my people will die. If this fails, we'll all die, Eldon said, meeting her gaze. But if it works, we'll show them that strength isn't just about brute force. Altria nodded, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face. Then we fight together. The first wave of Sky Riders descended in an ear-splitting cacophony of screeches and war cries. Their aerial predators, hulking reptilian beasts with massive wings, swooped low, their claws tearing through the upper levels of the village's platforms. Warriors raised their spears, but the creature's speed and ferocity made it nearly impossible to land a hit. "Activate the disruptors!" Eldon shouted from his position near the center of the village. Kira, stationed in the trees, pulled a vine. The jungle erupted with sharp, piercing sounds that sent the predators into frenzied confusion. Some collided with the platforms, while others veered off course, their riders struggling to regain control. Altria seized the opportunity. "Now, attack!" she commanded, her voice carrying above the chaos. The warriors surged forward, their spears and blades striking with precision. Altria led the charge, her movements a blend of grace and ferocity. Eldon stayed behind, coordinating the disruptors and monitoring the battle from a safe distance. He hated feeling helpless, but he knew his role was crucial. The tide began to turn in the tribe's favor. Altria's warriors used the jungle's terrain to their advantage, luring Sky Riders into traps and ambushes. However, the Sky Riders were relentless. Their ground forces pressed forward, overwhelming the tribe's defenses. Eldon spotted a group of warriors struggling against a heavily armored Sky Rider, wielding a weapon that emitted bursts of energy. The ground warriors were pinned down, unable to advance. "I can't just stand here," Eldon muttered to himself. He grabbed a disruptor vine and darted into the fray. Dodging debris and fallen branches, he reached the Sky Rider's position. With a deep breath, he activated the disruptor at close range. The sound wave struck the armored warrior, throwing him off balance. Altria appeared moments later, her spear striking true. "You're reckless, Earthman," she said as they regrouped. "Reckless but effective," Eldon shot back. Altria's lips quirked into what might have been a smile before she turned her attention back to the battle. The Sky Rider's leader, a towering figure clad in obsidian-like armor, entered the fight, riding a massive predator that dwarfed the others. His booming voice echoed through the jungle. "Your resistance is futile," he roared. "Submit, and we might spare your lives." Altria stepped forward, spear in hand. "This is our land. We will never submit." The leader's predator lunged, its claws slicing through the air. Altria dodged gracefully, landing a blow with her spear that glanced off the creature's thick hide. Eldon watched from a distance, his heart pounding. "She can't take him alone," he muttered. Spotting a reflective panel nearby, Eldon had an idea. He signaled to Kira, who understood immediately. Together, they adjusted the panel to reflect the sunlight directly into the predator's eyes. The beast roared in pain, momentarily blinded, giving Altria the opening she needed. With a powerful leap, she drove her spear into the predator's neck. The creature collapsed, throwing its rider to the ground. Altria approached the fallen leader, her spear poised to strike. Yield, she commanded. The leader glared up at her but said nothing. Altria tightened her grip on her spear, ready to finish him. Wait! Eldon called out, stepping forward. Altria turned, her expression sharp. What are you doing? Spare him, Eldon said. If he survives, he'll spread the word that your tribe isn't to be trifled with. It's a better deterrent than killing him. Altria hesitated, the weight of the decision clear on her face. Finally, she stepped back. Go, she said to the leader. Tell your tribe what happened here. The leader rose unsteadily, his eyes burning with hatred and humiliation. Without a word, he retreated into the jungle, followed by the remnants of his forces. As the battle ended, the tribe gathered in the village square. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and victory. Altria stood before her people, her presence commanding yet grounded. We have faced the Sky Riders and triumphed, she declared, not through strength alone, but through unity and wisdom. Let this be a lesson to us all. There is strength in adaptability. Her words were met with cheers, but her gaze sought Eldon's. He stood at the edge of the crowd, exhausted but relieved. She nodded subtly, a silent acknowledgment of his contribution. That evening, as the village celebrated, Eldon found himself on a high platform overlooking the jungle. The bioluminescent glow of the trees seemed more vibrant than ever. Altria joined him, her steps soft but purposeful. You fought well today, she said, her voice quieter than usual. I had good leadership, Eldon replied. Altria's lips twitched in a faint smile. You are insufferable. True, he said, leaning against the railing, but you're starting to like me anyway. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the jungle below. My people owe you a debt. I think we're even, Eldon said. Besides, I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Altria turned to face him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. Perhaps there is more to you than I thought, Earthman. Likewise, Your Majesty, Eldon said, his tone light but sincere. They stood in silence, the tension of the day giving way to something unspoken. The jungle hummed with life around them, a reminder that the world they fought to protect was still thriving. The day after the battle, the village was alive with activity. Warriors repaired damaged platforms, hunters brought back supplies, and healers tended to the injured. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of pride in the air, pride in having defended their home, and in the unexpected triumph that had brought them together. Eldon sat near the central spring, tinkering with one of his sonic disruptors. His arm was bandaged, and his movements were slower than usual, but his mind was racing with ideas. The disruptors had worked, but he wanted to refine them, to make them more reliable. You're a strange man, Kira said, approaching him with a basket of food. Most would rest after a fight like that. Rest is overrated, Eldon replied with a grin. Besides, this is how I relax. Kira shook her head, but set the basket down beside him. The elders are speaking of you. Some say your ideas saved us. Others... She hesitated. Others think I'm meddling where I don't belong, Eldon finished for her. Kira shrugged. You're not wrong. But even Naira has to admit your plan worked. Eldon's grin widened. Progress. The council met that evening in the largest tree, its interior carved into a circular chamber. Eldon was invited, though he felt the weight of every gaze as he entered. Altria sat at the head of the circle, her presence as commanding as ever. We must decide how to proceed, Altria began, her voice steady. The Sky Riders may return, and our victory has shown both our strengths and weaknesses. Ciala nodded. The outsiders' ideas proved useful, but they challenge our traditions. We must tread carefully. Eldon stood, clearing his throat. I don't want to replace your traditions. They're what make you strong, but sometimes adapting doesn't mean abandoning, it means evolving. Naira leaned forward, her expression skeptical. And how do we know your ways won't weaken us in the long term? You don't, Eldon admitted. But I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to try new things, to combine what you already know with what I can offer. Together, we can find a balance." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, Altria spoke. "He has proven his worth," she said, "and his survival among us has shown his resilience. I say we give him the chance to prove his ideas further." Naira frowned, but nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but the tribe will be watching." As the days passed, Eldon worked closely with Altria and her warriors, integrating small changes into their routines. He introduced methods for tracking predator movements and reinforced defensive positions using natural materials from the jungle. One evening, while overseeing the construction of a new watchtower, Eldon found himself alone with Altria. The air between them was easier now, the sharp edges of their earlier interactions softened by mutual respect. "You're good at this," Altria said, watching as Eldon directed a group of warriors. "I had to learn how to manage people," Eldon replied. "Back on Earth, I led a team of researchers. Different jungle, same principles." Altria tilted her head. "And yet you chose to leave your world to study ours. Why?" Eldon hesitated, his gaze distant. "Curiosity, I guess. I wanted to understand the unknown, to see if there were places where intellect mattered more than politics or power." "And have you found such a place?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "I think I'm standing in it." For a moment, Altria's usual composure wavered, her expression softening, but she quickly turned away, gesturing toward the warriors. "Enough talking. There's still work to do." The tribe's acceptance of Eldon wasn't without challenges. Some warriors resisted his ideas, seeing them as a threat to their identity. During a training session, a young warrior named Jaren openly questioned him. "Why should we listen to someone who doesn't know our ways?" Jaren demanded, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Eldon didn't flinch. "You don't have to listen to me, but if you want to survive the next attack, maybe you should listen to the results." Kira stepped forward, her voice firm. "He's earned his place here, and if you don't believe that, challenge him." Jaren hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. A test, then." The challenge wasn't combat, but strategy. Eldon and Jaren were each tasked with leading a small team through a simulated ambush in the jungle. Eldon relied on his observational skills and scientific knowledge, while Jaren used brute strength and traditional tactics. When the exercise ended, Eldon's team emerged victorious, having outmaneuvered their opponents without losing a single member. Jaren approached Eldon afterward, his expression grudgingly respectful. "Maybe you're not as weak as I thought." "Thanks," Eldon said with a grin. "I think." That night, Altria found Eldon sitting by the spring, staring at the water as it glowed faintly in the moonlight. She approached quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the soft ground. "Jaren challenged you today," she said. "Yeah," Eldon replied without looking up. "It went better than expected." "You've done more than I thought possible," she admitted, sitting beside him. Eldon turned to her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "So have you," he said gently. "Leading your people through all of this, it can't be easy." "It isn't," she said, her gaze distant. "But a leader has no choice." "You're more than a leader," Eldon said. "You're a survivor, and a damn good one." For a moment, they sat in silence, the tension between them giving way to a quiet understanding. Finally, Altria stood, her usual composure returning. "Don't let it go to your head, Earthman," she said, though her tone was lighter than usual. "Wouldn't dream of it," Eldon replied, watching as she disappeared into the shadows. The tribe stood united at dawn, watching as Eldon and Altria walked together toward the edge of the jungle. It had been weeks since the Sky Rider's defeat, but the tribe's energy had shifted from survival to progress. The structures Eldon had helped reinforce stood stronger than ever, and the jungle seemed to respond to their newfound harmony with its environment. Eldon paused near the spring that had become a central part of the tribe's life. He knelt, examining the water with his scanner, noting how the flow had stabilized. The once dwindling spring now thrived, surrounded by vibrant vegetation. "This," he said aloud, is what happens when you work with nature instead of against it. Altria stood nearby, her arms crossed as she watched him. You sound proud. Shouldn't I be? Eldon asked, standing to face her. This is a testament to what we accomplished. Together. Altria's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. You've proven your worth, Earthman, not just to me, but to my people. And you've proven you're willing to adapt, Eldon replied. That's no small thing for a leader. She tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips. Careful, or I might start believing you. The tribe gathered that evening for a ceremony to mark the changes within their village. Altria stood before her people, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed them. Our victory was not born of strength alone, she said. It came from unity, from wisdom, and from the courage to embrace new ideas without abandoning who we are. She gestured toward Eldon, who stood off to the side. This outsider has challenged us in ways we did not expect, but he has also shown us that strength comes in many forms. He is no longer an outsider. He is one of us. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Kira stepped forward, placing a hand over her heart in a gesture of respect. Others followed, creating a ripple of acceptance that filled the space. Eldon swallowed hard, unaccustomed to such recognition. Thank you, he said simply. Later that night, Eldon found himself on the high platform overlooking the glowing jungle. It had become his refuge, a place to think and reflect. He was surprised when Altria joined him, her steps quiet but deliberate. You keep returning here, she said, standing beside him. It's peaceful, Eldon replied, and it reminds me why we fought so hard to protect this place. Altria nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. My people have always believed in strength above all, but you've shown me that strength can take many forms. Admitting that has not been easy. Growth never is, Eldon said. They stood in silence for a moment, the bioluminescent light casting a soft glow around them. Finally, Altria turned to him. You could leave, you know, she said quietly. Your ship is being repaired. You could return to your world, to the life you had before. Eldon met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. I could, he said, but I'm not sure I want to. Her eyes searched his face, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. And why is that? Because here I've found something worth staying for, Eldon replied, his voice steady. Something I didn't know I was looking for. For the first time, Altria let her guard down completely. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You are insufferable, Earthman. And yet, you keep me around, Eldon said with a small smile. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. The kiss was slow and deliberate, a culmination of the tension and understanding that had grown between them. When they pulled apart, Altria's expression was softer, her voice quieter. You've changed me, Eldon. Maybe you've changed me too, he replied. The days that followed were marked by progress. Eldon worked closely with the tribe, teaching them to refine the tools they had built together, while learning their traditions in return. The balance they struck was delicate but harmonious, blending innovation with deep respect for the tribe's roots. One afternoon, Kira approached Eldon as he worked on a new sonic disruptor. We're holding a training session later, she said. You should come. Me? Training? Eldon asked, raising an eyebrow. You've earned your place here, Kira replied. It's time you learned to fight like one of us. Eldon hesitated, then grinned. I guess it's never too late to pick up a spear. On the final night of the ceremony week, the tribe gathered again to honor their ancestors and celebrate the future. Altria stood at the center, her ceremonial armor gleaming in the firelight. Eldon stood beside her, no longer the outsider, but a part of something greater. As the fires burned and the tribe danced, Altria leaned close to Eldon. You've given us hope, Earthman, not just for survival, but for something more. Eldon looked at her, his smile warm. You've given me the same, Your Majesty. The jungle hummed with life around them, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, growth and unity were possible. Together they had forged a new path, one that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of the future.